A news bulletin revealed the closure of California's IndyMac Bank and how it became a major downfall.
Last night, there was an emergency meeting in Washington. The leader...
GTX Bobby Walker entered his office. Nan, his assistant, followed him inside and mentioned that Sally Wilcox was waiting in the conference room. Bobby then headed to the staff room, where everyone seemed upset. He asked what was wrong, but no one replied. So he stood up and walked to Connell's office. Bobby asked Connell what was going on. Connell told him they had shut down the mobile phone division in Newport News. He added that they'd merged the ship system with a rail product. Corporate code for job cuts disguised as progress. Bobby then went to Sally's office and asked for details. Sally introduced him to Dick Landry from legal. Landry told Bobby the company had restructured and would offer benefits to make up for the 12 years they'd worked together.
You're 12 years with us entitled to 12 weeks full pay and benefits.
Bobby asked if they were letting him go. Sally assured him they'd also offer support for future employment services. He angrily demanded to know if G was aware of the decision. Sally asked him to sit down, but he refused and walked out.
Sally, f*** off.
One day, he's Bruce Wayne running Wayne Enterprises. The next, he's Bobby Walker standing outside GTX with a cardboard box. From billionaire to broke. Guess even Batman can't dodge corporate downsizing. Bobby began packing his things to leave. His secretary asked what they'd said about her position. He told her he hadn't asked. At Jean's office, Phil was waiting. Jean noticed Phil's expression and asked what was wrong. His assistant replied that Sally had just laid off some of the ship system sales team.
All day.
They closed Mobile and Newport News.
Jean asked Phil if Sally had fired him too. Phil said she hadn't and admitted he'd been hiding in his office all day. Then he shouted that no one would ever fire him after 30 years of service. 3 decades of loyalty gone in 30 seconds. Turns out dedication doesn't guarantee job security. At Bobby's house, Maggie Walker came home. She went outside and saw Bobby cooking. When she asked why he was home so early, he said he was making dinner. Maggie told him they were supposed to go to Jack's that evening, but Bobby refused. Upset, she went back inside and Bobby followed. They argued. She asked why he wouldn't go and why he disliked Jack. That's when Bobby finally told her he'd been fired.
To me today.
Maggie asked about Jean, reminding Bobby that he'd promised to make sure his job was safe. Bobby told her Jean hadn't been in the office all day and that Sally Wilcox was the one who made the call. Funny how "we're in this together" so quickly turns into sorry. Meanwhile, Phil returned home and asked his daughter, Susan Rico, where her mother was. She told him her mom had a headache. As Phil started upstairs, Susan called out and said they'd just learned their next trip was to Italy. She asked if she was going too. Phil told her she would. But he wasn't sure about himself. A vacation to Italy sounds perfect, if you still have a job to return to. Phil went to the bedroom and when his wife saw him, she asked if he'd heard that Colin was fired and whether they were safe. Phil reassured her and said they should get ready for Salinger's dinner. Because when your financial world is collapsing, nothing says stability like a fancy evening out.
You don't have to come if you're not feeling up to it.
Just give me a minute.
At the same time, Gene stood blankly at the table, dropping ice into his bottle. His wife came up behind him and reminded him they had to leave early, they couldn't be late again. Meanwhile, Bobby, Maggie, and their kids arrived at Jack's house. They went inside and greeted everyone. Jack asked Bobby how the shift was going from his high-paying corporate job to whatever came next.
Why don't you grab yourself a drink, Bobby? We got some margaritas in the...
Bobby? We've got some margaritas in the blender, got it at the Man of the Year party. The host then introduced Gene McClary, Executive Vice President of GTX, as one of the company's earliest employees. Gene took the stage, speaking about the patience it took to endure the company's toughest years and praising James for turning GTX into a massive success. Gene then invited James to the front.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Without a doubt, you don't build a company.
Then giving yourself an award for visionary leadership. If that's not a corporate villain arc, I don't know what is. The next day, Bobby attended a job training session. When he arrived, Danny greeted him and asked where he was headed. Bobby said it was for orientation, and Danny pointed him toward the right room. Inside, a woman explained the job requirements, reminding them that fear and anxiety were natural parts of the process.
Neighbors, dentists, anybody, and every.
After orientation, Bobby looked around for a place to sit. When he found one, a worker told him the seat was taken. Then Danny called out to him, offering an empty chair nearby. Bobby thanked him and sat down. Danny joked that everyone was intimidated by him because he was the new guy, yet somehow
Tell them you're lucky you still have a job.
met to discuss the merger between the ship systems and rail products divisions. Phil and Nan joined the meeting as staff voiced frustrations about managing the same number of accounts with half the workforce. Phil reminded them they were fortunate to still have jobs in times like these. Then he steered the discussion.
You're not threatened.
Bobby asked Danny why he wasn't afraid. Danny replied that he was just a confident guy. He then asked Bobby how long he'd be staying, and Bobby explained he had 3 months of full salary and 4 months of outplacement. Danny mentioned he'd had 9 months but had already used 4. It's like a ticking time bomb. How long can you stretch those months before the real panic sets in? Later, Gene and Bobby met for lunch. Gene asked how things were going for him and his family, and Bobby said everything was fine. Gene explained they'd made the cuts because the company was in serious trouble.
Salinger's under a lot of pressure to boost the stock price before somebody buys it.
There was a lot of pressure to raise the stock price before someone swooped in and bought the company. Gene told Bobby he'd contacted some marketers, listed their names, and handed him a sheet of paper. Bobby grew angry, dropped the paper, and stormed out, saying he'd steal those same clients once he joined a competitor.
Go.
Grace.
At home,
Maggie and Bobby talked about his meeting with Gene. Bobby mentioned that Gene was helping him reach out to marketers, which Maggie appreciated. Holding a stack of unpaid bills, she suggested getting a job herself to help with expenses. Just then, Bobby's father, Kevin, called. Maggie handed him the phone, but Bobby refused. He didn't want another round of advice about the layoffs he'd just read about in the paper. Meanwhile, at the office, later at home, Gene sat outside when Cynthia approached, asking if he was all right. He mentioned having lunch with Bobby and half expecting him to throw a drink in his face. Cynthia then said she and Sue were planning a weekend trip to Palm Beach and asked to use the corporate jet. Seeing Gene's reaction, she quickly added that they'd just fly commercial instead.
Fine, we'll fly commercial.
Bruce Wayne would just buy another mansion without a second thought, but Bobby Walker was holding on to a life he could no longer afford, hoping no one noticed. The interviewer looked over his sales background and asked about regional experience, which he confirmed. She then offered him a position outside his area for $65,000 a year. Offended, Bobby snapped that he'd made $120,000 at GTX and had applied for a VP of marketing role. She calmly replied that they already had many highly qualified candidates.
I'm a highly qualified applicant for that position.
But every response was a rejection. Phil Knight built Nike from nothing into a billion-dollar empire. Bobby Walker, at this rate, would be lucky to sell sneakers from his trunk just to cover rent. Frustrated, Bobby kept calling Sally, leaving voicemails. "Hi Sally, Bob Walker here. Thanks for not returning any of my calls." Then he went home, where he found Drew sitting outside alone. When Bobby asked what was wrong, Drew said he could handle things, that he was growing up. Bobby then admitted he'd lost his job but promised everything would be fine. At Jack's house for Thanksgiving, the men discussed business while food was served. Jack asked Bobby about work, and Bobby gave a vague answer. Jack mentioned reading that Salinger made 700 times more than the average GTX worker, a sharp reminder that those at the top rarely feel the pain of those at the bottom. Before eating, Carson prayed, thanking God for their health and asking that her dad find a job, exposing Bobby's unemployment to everyone. Jack offered Bobby a job, but he refused. "Could always use some extra help hanging drywall," Jack said. Meanwhile, James and his business partner discussed financial losses, debating whether to sell the new business or shut down the old one. They settled on layoffs. Gene privately told James he disagreed, but James brushed him off. "I've always told you what I thought, right or wrong, and this is wrong," Gene said. Of course, the first solution is always layoffs, never executive pay cuts or restructuring. Later, Maggie and Bobby discussed finances in bed. Maggie mentioned they could sell the house for $850,000 if they lowered the price. She asked why he refused Jack's offer, but Bobby insisted he wouldn't work under him. At this point, pride was all Bobby had left and he was holding onto it for dear life. That same night, Jean and Sally lay in bed. Jean asked her about the downsizing criteria, and she grew irritated, eventually leaving him alone. Soon after, Bobby went golfing with a teammate, only to be told his membership was unpaid. He confronted Maggie, who explained they couldn't afford next month's payment and urged him to stop golfing and focus on finding work. Bobby wanted to keep up appearances, but Maggie reminded him of their reality and told him to cancel the plans. Nothing says fall from grace quite like being kicked off the golf course. Later, Bobby and Maggie had a heartfelt talk. Feeling hopeless, Bobby shouted that at 37 he couldn't even support his family. Maggie comforted him, reminding him that they still had each other, wrapping him in a reassuring hug. Bobby then went to another job interview. The interviewer mentioned a glowing recommendation from Dan Mass and explained that the position paid $90,000 a year, plus commission and bonuses. Though he couldn't promise anything, he said Bobby seemed like the right fit. Finally, a lifeline or so it seemed. When Bobby called later to follow up, he was told the job was no longer available. Heartbroken, Bobby watched as the person who bought his car drove it away. First the golf membership, now the car piece by piece, Bobby's old life was slipping away. At a party, Phil approached Jean and revealed that Sally had fired him. Jean rushed to his office and confronted Sally, who handed him a paper he was fired too. Jean and Phil later sat together, stunned by the company they'd devoted their lives to. Feeling betrayed, Jean went home and ignored his wife's calls to come upstairs. Meanwhile, Phil started a new job on the factory floor at Joanna's office, surprising Bobby and the others. Joanna asked Phil if he smoked. When he admitted he did occasionally, she told him to quit. As he left, she added, "You're pushing 60 and look like hell it's going to be rough out there." Bobby visited Phil's new office and commented that the company was paying extra for the separate space. Phil replied it was the least they could do after all his years of service. Then he asked about the dress code, and Bobby said casual clothes were fine. At home, Bobby got on the phone with the mortgage company, explaining he'd spoken to someone last week who said he hadn't paid this month. He offered to write a check and send it in. Maggie came downstairs, smiling faintly as she listened. When he hung up, she asked who he'd been talking to. Bobby replied quietly, "It was the mortgage company."
Which one, American Express?
Maggie then mentioned that IED had asked her to work the next night. Bobby frowned and reminded her it was New Year's Eve. Before the tension could grow, Drew came downstairs and asked if his dad could drive him to Kyle's. Bobby, still frustrated, told him he was busy.
Should play some Xbox.
Oh, hey, Bobby, hang on a sec.
Bobby paused, realizing what Maggie had said. Drew had returned his Xbox because he knew they couldn't afford it. Nothing cuts deeper than a child silently giving up something they love just to ease their parents' burden. The weight of it finally broke through Bobby's pride. Later,
I need a job, Jack.
Jack hired him that very day. Soon, Bobby found himself hauling timber beside him on the construction site. Exhausted, he paused, but Jack smirked and told him to grab 2 more. Once a high-flying executive, Bobby was now struggling just to lift a 2x4. That's what real character growth looks like. During lunch, they sat in an unfinished room. Bobby ate quietly, staring at his blistered hands. One worker noticed and told him the gloves were new. That's why they hurt. He handed Bobby an old pair. A small act, but it spoke volumes. Bobby wasn't just working, he was learning humility. The next morning, while sandblasting, they told him to add another sack to the mix. It was too thin.
Insane on it.
Meanwhile, at home, Jean and Sally talk about their day. She asks about his plans and mentions that Ed and Dana, her old friends, have invited them to dinner that night. Elsewhere, Phil arrives for an interview. After introducing himself at reception, he's told to sign in and wait. The room is packed with applicants, each one chasing the same chance. Back on site, Jack hands Bobby his paycheck. Bobby notices an extra $200 and asks about it. Jack shrugs and says,
Mistake, Bob.
Gene goes to dinner with Sally and her old friends, forcing a smile though his eyes betray the truth. He's playing the part of a man in charge, but inside the walls are closing in. Meanwhile, Bobby and his family move into his parents' house. He checks on Drew, who's lying in bed with earphones on. Bobby gently pulls them off and asks if he's okay sharing a room with his sister for a while. Drew says it's fine. Once, Bobby bought sneakers without checking the price. Now, he's deciding which pair to sell, just to stay afloat. Phil Knight would not approve. Later, Gene's son Liam visits with his family. As the kids play outside, Gene tells Liam he's looking into buying a vineyard in June and searching for work. Liam asks if he's spoken to his mother, then adds that she's been thinking,
Pretty rough time. She's talking about selling the house.
Bobby shows up at work, but Mike isn't there. When he asks about him, he's told Mike got arrested again, assault, drunk, and disorderly. Bobby then tells Jack he knows someone who can fill in. Soon after, Danny joins the crew and starts working another casualty of the job market, trading his briefcase for a hammer. Meanwhile, Gene finds Phil at a bar, drinking alone. When Phil offers to drive him home, Gene admits he can't. His wife doesn't want the neighbors knowing he's been fired.
Want to go to the movies?
Meanwhile, Bobby returns home and his mother tells him someone named Fred Mund called, offering him a position. The job is in Boston, but Bobby decides to take it. Maggie is skeptical, yet Bobby insists it's for Vice President of Sales and Marketing, the exact role he's been chasing all along.
My job. I don't know what else I can look for.
A vice president title?
The president title sounds like a dream, except dreams don't usually come with fine print. Like they said in Argo, this is the best bad idea they've got. Bobby heads to Boston, staying overnight in a modest motel. The next morning, he arrives for what he thinks is his interview, only to learn it's actually scheduled for next week, not this Friday. Meanwhile, Phil meets James for lunch and mentions an opening for foreign executives. James seems interested but coldly admits he wouldn't hire anyone over 30 for that role. It's a killer. So much for decades of experience. Later that night, Gene finds Phil outside the GTX building, hurling rocks in anger and despair. Phil confides his financial struggles, but neither man has any answers. Back home, Phil quietly washes dishes, walks into his garage, lights a cigarette, starts his car, and ends his life by carbon monoxide poisoning. The next day, Gene, Bobby, and the others stand solemnly at Phil's funeral, a tragic but familiar fate for those crushed beneath the weight of lost purpose. Afterward, Bobby and Gene visit the site of their first jobs, reminiscing about better days that now exist only in memory.
Now everything I spent 30 years trying to build for myself and everybody else is...
Bobby returns home and apologizes to Maggie for letting her down, but she reassures him that everything will pass, that they'll get through it together. The next day, Gene visits GTX to confront James, asking why he didn't attend Phil's funeral. Instead of remorse, James deflects, speaking about Phil's wife. When Gene presses him, questioning why he fired loyal employees if the company was doing well, James coldly replies that he only did what the market demanded, that it was necessary to survive. Back home, Bobby gets a call from Gene about a new job opportunity. Later that day, he stops by Jack's worksite to tell him about the offer, admitting he's thinking of staying because he's grown to like the work and the people.
You should take that job.
Gene, now running his own firm called MLAR Maritime Associates, sits confidently in his new office. Sally enters, congratulating him on the achievement and suggesting they grab lunch sometime, but Gene politely declines. As she leaves, she turns back and asks him to keep her in mind for any future opportunities. Maybe as an associate, with fresh energy, she adds, with a hopeful smile. Moments later, Bobby walks into the same office, greeting the team before diving straight into work, giving directions, checking files, and settling into his role.
We work as hard in here every day as we did trying to get a job. We're gonna be all right.